Hello and welcome to the Data Dimensions webinar series, brought to you by the Master of Science in Data Analytics and Policy program and the Johns Hopkins University Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Today's event features a discussion on careers in evaluation science. Please note today's event will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the Data Dimensions playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function and we will answer as many questions as possible during the latter portion of the event. With that, I will turn over the presentation to our moderator, Dr. Collin Paschall, Program Director and Senior Lecturer for the Master of Science in Data Analytics and Policy program.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Natalie, and thank you to everyone who's in attendance today. Again, my name is Collin Paschall. I'm the Program Director for the Data Analytics and Policy program here at Johns Hopkins University. I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Chris Krompart, who is the Assistant Program Director and also an Assistant Lecturer. And we're also joined by our guest today, Dr. Scott Davis. Very pleased to be joined today by Dr. Davis, who is currently a visiting assistant professor at Centre College in Danville, Kentucky. I had a chance earlier this year to meet Dr. Davis, and after hearing a little bit about his career, I thought he'd be a perfect match for this event. As most of you, I think, know, the Data Analytics and Policy program here at Johns Hopkins emphasizes evidence-based policy analysis and evaluation using a variety of statistical and econometric methods. And indeed, Dr. Davis has a wealth of experience in this domain. After getting his PhD in economics at the University of Virginia, he embarked on a long career in policy and program evaluation, including as the principal economist with the American Institutes of Research. And looking at his CV, Dr. Davis led studies of many different grant programs at different levels of government, reemployment services, other social services, which he can talk a bit more about in his presentation today, but has a real hands-on experience doing the kinds of analysis that we teach in this program, and has had a long career in this domain that I thought you all might like to hear more about. So very glad that Dr. Davis has come back to the realm of academia, over to the good side for a little while, but he can talk more about that transition as well, and the choices he's made over the course of his career. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Davis, and I'll start just by asking him to kind of introduce himself a little bit, tell us a little bit about his current role, what he's doing at Centre College now, and then just a bit about his sort of professional academic trajectory, broadly speaking, and then we'll get into some more details as we go.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Collin. I appreciate the introduction, and thanks again for having me. I've been looking forward to this event. It's exciting for me to be able to talk to your students and kind of tell them a little bit about sort of my experience and my career doing sort of research and evaluation work to try to inform policy, as you said, at several different levels. So I can give you a very kind of brief overview of sort of how I arrived at where I am now, which is, as you said, I'm a visiting associate professor of economics at Centre College. Centre College is my alma mater. So I graduated from Centre many years ago, and I went straight to graduate school at the University of Virginia after I finished my undergraduate degree. So one of the things that I really loved about economics and what I wanted to do when I decided to go to graduate school was that I felt like economics offered a way to kind of subjectively or sort of a way to sort of evaluate public programs, and in a way to kind of understand like whether they're working the way they were intended to work, and thinking about kind of ways to improve them and things like that. And so when I decided to go to grad school, that was what I wanted to do. I wanted to get a PhD in economics so that I could then do this sort of applied policy-oriented research. And so that's essentially what I did. After I finished my degree, I was on the job market as a newly minted PhD economist. I was consciously looking for positions that were not in academia. Again, there are a lot of organizations that do this sort of policy-focused research evaluation work. I left grad school, and the first place that I worked was a place called CNA. I used to stand for the Center for Naval Analyses. They do a lot of work to support the Navy and the Marine Corps. I was at CNA for I think about 4 years, transitioned to another place called Impact International that did similar types of work, but there I really started doing more work focused on sort of workforce programs, like labor market programs and things like that. And then most recently, for nearly 7 years, I was at a place called the American Institutes for Research, so based in Washington. I think actually based in Arlington now, but there I continued doing sort of labor focused work, and also started doing some education focused work. So I was at AIR through the spring of this year. And then left the organization and took a position at Center at my alma mater to get back into academia. The one thing that I sort of missed about academia when I left academia was the teaching. And Center is a small liberal arts college that sort of emphasizes teaching in a kind of residential setting. And so that really, I had a wonderful experience there. I was very excited about the opportunity to return and contribute to the college that way. So then, Collin, you and I crossed paths. And that led me to be here today, eventually.
Great. Yes. So I wonder if we could kind of just go back in time a little bit then, because you mentioned that
Sure.
very early on, you were interested in doing this kind of program evaluation and trying to figure out kind of what works through the lens of economics. So were there any sort of experiences when you were an undergrad or other sort of employment experiences or life experiences that kind of sparked that for you? Or where did that interest sort of first spring up for you?
Yeah, I think even kind of prior to coming to college. So when I started college, I sort of wanted to go to law school. That was sort of what I had in mind. I wanted to be an English major and go to law school. And I didn't really know anything about sort of what lawyers did or what that meant as a career, other than it seemed pretty stable and it seemed like it would be sort of a good job. And so I was sort of interested in sort of government and in policy as just sort of a subject. And when I was an undergraduate, it was one of the early economics classes I took. It might have been the intro to economics class, where it just struck me as such an interesting and kind of systematic way of kind of looking at the world and the way things work and why people make the decisions they make and why policies kind of have the effects that they have. And it struck me as just a useful lens for doing that type of work, to kind of understand and whether policies are working the way we want them to. And I also came at this from the position of I also wanted to kind of do things that would help people, right? So I felt like this was a way, like if we as a society decide that there are these, specific programs that we put into place for certain reasons, like a lot of times because we want to help people, with challenges they may face. This seemed to be a way to try to make sure that those things were working, and that we were designing them as best we could, and that we were sort of understanding, ways we might improve them once they're actually out there and working. So, I mean, I think it was just those early economics courses that really struck me and got me going in that direction. I also had a wonderful advisor as an undergraduate. I think he was an economics professor, and I think he had a lot to do with my ultimate career trajectory.
So would you consider yourself as sort of a professional that works in this sort of evidence-based policy domain? I mean, sometimes that term has like a very specific sort of term of art to it. Do you consider yourself a practitioner of evidence-based policy making or policy evaluation, or what is your relationship to that sort of theme in our politics and policy more broadly?
Sure, that's a good question. So I think in my current role, I still plan to sort of be involved in that type of work through my research. But in my day-to-day work now, I'm sort of more focused on undergraduate teaching. But speaking a little bit about sort of my role up to maybe last spring, when I was when I worked in organizations that were very focused on that type of work, I think yes, certainly the type of applied research that I was doing and that organizations like the American Institutes for Research and similar organizations do is very much in support of this idea of making and implementing evidence-based policy. And there had been a trend for many years in the recent past toward a greater role for evidence in policymaking and sort of requirements at kind of certainly the federal level for agencies to generate and use evidence on the programs that they administer. And so over my career, there have been projects where there's a very clear link between what we're doing and whatever sort of product would come out of that work, like a report or something like that. There's a very clear link between that and how policymakers are going to sort of use that information to make decisions about either continuing a policy as it's currently operating, or maybe thinking about changes that need to be made, or whether the policy, whether some program, really needs to be rethought. A lot of times those, that type of work, the research and evaluation type work I was doing, was very valuable and was really looked for, was received by policymakers positively. So.
I wonder if you could give sort of an even more concrete, example of a project that
Sure.
you've worked on recently, at some point, at AIR that, provided that kind of information and maybe did lead to a policy change or did have a sort of a positive impact on the performance of a program.
Sure. So a couple examples come to mind. So one is a project that is sort of finished and it falls into that category. Another is a project that didn't quite get to the finish line, but I can still sort of just talk a little bit about the way that we had envisioned that working and sort of how it falls into that category you're describing. So the first is a project at the state level, where I was working with some colleagues outside of AIR to evaluate a reemployment program that is run by a state. So this was, in this case, the state of Wisconsin. And the way this program works is it's a program that's intended to help people that have become unemployed, to help them sort of get back to work quickly. And the way the program works is it's intended to sort of identify individuals that might face, that look like they might face some challenges finding another job, and they might be out of work for a while, and to provide them with some more intensive support services to help them in their job search. It's a program called RESEA. It stands for Reemployment Services Eligibility Assessment. So in Wisconsin, the project was run by another organization. I was working as in the role of like a subcontractor to this other organization. The organization is called Actus Policy Research, ACTUS. And essentially we worked with the state of Wisconsin to design and implement a randomized controlled trial, like an RCT, an experiment. So, and the states have some flexibility in the way that they operate these programs, the types of services they offer and that sort of thing. And for example, one of the things they can do is individuals that participate in this program have to come in for a meeting with some counselors that will help them sort of think about their job search and help orient them to some services that are available to support them. But states could also require individuals to come back for another meeting later if they feel like that person, may need some additional support. So in Wisconsin was interested in knowing, like, what is the value of having individuals come for a second meeting? Like, is there sort of extra value in having unemployment insurance claimants in RESEA come back for that second meeting? So the experiment had two different treatment arms. So some individuals were only required, that were assigned to the treatment group, were only required to kind of come for one meeting. Others assigned to another treatment group were required to come for two. We randomly assigned over, I think it was maybe over 48,000 unemployment insurance claimants over the course of, I think it was close to 2 years, tracked their outcomes, and then sort of analyzed the value, the extra impact of having individuals go to a second meeting. And we found there were some kind of, some benefits there in terms of some of the outcomes that we were looking at and some of the things that the state was interested in. But I mean, I think that is that's a clear example of, like, the state operates this program. They have some flexibility in how they, the requirements they set for individuals that participate in the program. And there was a really rigorous study of the potential value of one way of, or the sort of extra value of requiring that extra meeting. So one way of designing the program. And I think the state, was happy to get the results and to use those in thinking about how the program works. So that's sort of one example where things, of a project that has run its course, essentially. The other project that comes to mind is a project that didn't make it to the finish line, which was at the federal level, and it was a national evaluation of career and technical education in the U.S. So CTE is an educational sort of policy to help sort of students in high school and even in middle school sort of learn more about career options and things like that, and better prepare them to make decisions about post-secondary education, if that's what they want to do, or other career paths, right? It's to sort of help them make decisions about those types of things as they sort of progress in their lives. And so at the federal level, states receive funding from the federal government that they can use to operate, to implement CTE. And we were working on a study to kind of evaluate kind of what states do with the money and whether those, how CTE works in the states is, whether that appears to be sort of consistent with what policymakers are setting out to achieve by funding CTE. So for that study, we had, we had collected some survey data. That study was not a rigorous kind of RCT. That was more essentially descriptive, or would have been. But data were collected from states and for school districts about sort of how CTE works in practice. And the idea was that policymakers at the federal level would then know, for example, there are a lot of flexibilities in how states can use the funding, things like that. The idea was that the data would show, how are states using the funding? And is that then policymakers could consider whether the flexibilities they're giving to states are causing states to sort of implement CTE in ways that that policymakers want them to, or are states sort of not doing the things that that policymakers intended, and then Congress might need to be more prescriptive about how the money is used and things like that. So again, that project unfortunately didn't sort of make it all the way to the finish line, but I think that's another concrete example of of policymakers and their interest in traditionally in knowing those types of in receiving that type of evidence.
Great, thanks very much. Yeah, actually, I kind of want to follow up on that because this is something I'm always curious
Sure.
in as an outside observer to these processes who's interested in evidence-based policymaking. I wonder how you would characterize kind of the appetite of those political decision makers for sort of empirical policy analysis, because I think there's some competing interests here, right? On the one hand, policymakers have an interest in preserving pet projects or attacking projects that are, against their ideological beliefs or they believe are a waste of money, things like that, sort of a predetermined conclusion about it. On the other hand, policymakers also want things to work. They have an interest in, protecting the public coffers and being efficient with the way policies are implemented. So I think that sometimes you could have policymakers who sort of genuinely want to receive this information, and to be cynical, there are some that are less inclined to sort of process this kind of information objectively. What's been your experience with sort of working with sponsors of these projects in terms of the way they receive the results and sort of their attitude towards maybe getting results that they may not like for one reason or the other?
Yeah, no, I think that's another really good question. And I think it's hard to say, that there's any consistent sort of expectation there is variation across sort of how well policymakers or sort of maybe how deeply invested or interested policymakers are in this type of evidence. But I would say that by and large, my experience has been that they are very interested in the kind of results of well done research that can shed light on whether the programs that they administer are working or ways that they might be improved. I would say almost uniformly, if there has been research done that has been well executed and has been done well, policymakers really do want to know sort of what the findings were and kind of what the results were. And again, I think my experience has always been that I think this is true across kind of federal, state, and local levels, is that a lot of policymakers are also interested in making sure that these programs are working and achieving kind of what they've set out to achieve. I think your point is fair that there may be some policymakers who take the view that some of these programs maybe shouldn't exist, period, or something like that. And in those cases, those individuals might be less inclined to really kind of consider carefully the results of kind of a research study. I don't know if I can recall ever coming across or certainly working with anyone kind of anybody on the sort of policy side that's sort of taken that view or expressed that sort of opinion. Again, I feel like in the recent past, there has clearly been a trend toward using evidence in policy decisions kind of broadly. And I think that although that may, there may be some policymakers that have not necessarily really embraced that. I think by and large, most have, or at least that's been my experience. So
That's really encouraging to hear, actually, because we live in a time where I think there's, I think it's fair to say that expertise is, there's a lot of a skeptical reaction to expertise in many corners of our political world right now, at least in sort of the top line media coverage that we see. So it's good to hear that there's still, some core interest in sort of getting to the bottom of some of these matters. I think Chris has a question. Chris?
So I do have a question, but we also have a
Sure.
question in the chat that ties into directly what we were just talking about. So I'll ask that question, then I'll ask my question. So Holly asks Scott, do you find resistance from policymakers to analysis done with advanced methods? In other words, if it is something like the advanced statistical model, using terms that are unfamiliar to them, is it hard to get them to hear the results of that?
Yeah, so that's another. These are all really great questions. So I appreciate, Collin, your questions and the questions in the chat. So, I mean, I think that I wouldn't necessarily say resistance to using sort of sophisticated methods or sort of complicated, technical approaches. I would say that it can be more difficult to sort of communicate clearly what it is that the study set out to do and how it, the sort of methods you used. It's very important to be able to explain it in simple, to be able to explain those things in simple terms. And so, I don't know. I think in a lot of the work that I've done, I mean, the offices that I've interacted with at the in terms of like the federal or state or local sort of practitioners, a lot of times there are offices there in those agencies that are sort of responsible for kind of conducting research or supporting research or using research and that sort of thing. And so the individuals in those roles will typically, they understand kind of what methods you're using and sort of the different types of approaches you might take to understand the impact of a particular program. So they would be familiar with different techniques, different like quasi-experimental methods and things like that. So I think it's not that using a sophisticated method is sort of automatically going to make it difficult to kind of convince someone that your results are sort of valid and useful. But I think it can be trickier to be able to, in terms of just communicating kind of what you've done and the results that you got. And Holly, I don't know if that answers your question, but hopefully it does. Then
if you have a follow-up, feel free, Holly, to the chat. So I'll go ahead and ask my question. It's kind of at the opposite end of the continuum from like advanced statistical. And so you've talked a lot about RCTs, and I'm fascinated by RCTs. I often tell my students it's like kind of the gold standard of if we want to do causal inference. I've never done an RCT before. I've done survey experiments online, which are pretty, straightforward once you have the budget. But I'd love to hear you talk about sort of your experience with RCTs and your role, where it seems like, obviously a lot goes into the design, but it's also like project management, like it's skills that we don't necessarily have. And so if you could kind of talk a little bit about the skills that went with that, and if you have like any stories about something that you learned that you wouldn't have expected going in.
Sure. No. Yeah. So I think I agree with you that so RCTs are certainly the way to go if you want to generate sort of the most solid evidence you can generate on the impact of some program that you're interested in, right? For all the reasons that a lot of your students are probably familiar with. But if you're looking for sort of causal impacts, RCTs are certainly the way to go. So I've had experience working on RCTs in some different contexts. I mean, one that comes to mind is a study that I worked on where we worked with a state agency in Ohio to test a text messaging intervention aimed at youth that were in a workforce program in Ohio. So these were young people. I believe it was between 16 and maybe 24 or something like that. And these were youth that were sort of coming from backgrounds where they faced a lot of challenges, and the idea was to sort of help them with supports to help them figure out sort of how they might kind of begin to define a career or sort of identify employment opportunities for them and prepare for those opportunities and that sort of thing. And the idea was to see if a series of text messages would help encourage some of these youth to be more engaged with the program, like to actually use the services available from the program more than they would otherwise, right? So we worked with, so that in terms of just the practical challenges of implementing an RCT, I mean, we went through several steps. Like we had to, first we talked with the person at the state level, thinking about like how this might work. We talked with some folks in one particular county that was kind of very interested, and started developing sort of some plans and like a prototype of how the intervention would work. Then we recruited several other counties in Ohio. I think we ultimately ended up implementing the experiment in like 11 counties, I think it was, in the state. And then the way it worked was essentially we had to figure out the logistics of how we were going to randomize these youth that have enrolled in this program, and they're enrolling sort of on an ongoing basis. And so we ended up coming up with kind of a process where the state would every week, they would send us a list of here are all the new youth that have enrolled in this program in the counties that are participating in the study. We took that list, we would randomly assign kind of which youth would be assigned to the treatment group that's going to receive the text messages, and which would be in the control group that would not. And then we would send the state a separate a list of all the youth that are in the treatment group. And then the state was responsible for sending out the text messages through a platform that they had access to. And we also had to kind of design the messages and send those to the state. But as you can imagine, I mean, there's a lot of moving parts for that to kind of continue and to run smoothly. I mean, we had to sort of think about things like, well, what if the normal day we've set up for the state to send us the data happens to fall on like a holiday and there's nobody there to send us the data? Is that going to be a problem? Or like, what do we do? And sort of what's the right format? Do we need, that we need the state to send us the data in? Or what's the format we need to send the data to the state? What's the format we need to use when we send the list back to the state so that they can kind of text the right people and use kind of the right phone number and that sort of thing? So it gets to be very, it's very important to kind of pay attention to a lot of small details and to be very organized and think, do some very careful planning up front about kind of the very specific ways that those things are going to play out. And fortunately, in that case, we were able to we ran the experiment for quite a while, but then for several weeks. And then again, maybe just as another example of real world issues that can come up, the state at the time used a particular system for its case management processes. And so this was like an administrative database where as a youth would kind of receive a service that would get entered into a database that we could then get data from later so that we could see, like, we could measure outcomes and things like that. Well, it turned out that shortly into our data collection period, I can't remember exactly how long, it might have been 12 or 13 weeks in, the state migrated to a different case management system. And we had known that this was going to happen. It was sort of, it was a known event, but there were all kinds of problems with that transition. And it ended up meaning that we weren't able to get any outcomes data from the new system, like once that came online. So it sort of truncated the period of time for which we could observe outcomes for those individuals. We were still able to kind of get some interesting results and kind of complete the study. But again, I think it's just another example of the things that can happen and can come up when you actually go to do these things in practice, right? And some you can sort of try to anticipate and have plans in place for what to do, like if the date falls on a holiday when we're intending to transfer data. But others, it's sort of, you just have to sort of do your best to react. Like if the administrative data system changeover doesn't quite go as planned. So does that answer your question, Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. I was honestly, just interested in hearing sort of stories about how they're done, because we read about them all the time, and it just seems like there's probably so much behind the scenes in terms of actually executing it, and things that you can't possibly anticipate, and then you just have to respond to it. So I really appreciate that. Thanks, Scott.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah, thank you for that insight. I'm really interested in kind of the nuts and bolts aspects of these kinds of studies, right? Because in our coursework, we can teach people about the potential outcomes framework, and we can teach them about randomized controlled trials, and we can all like calculate average treatment effects and do this kind of thing. But really seeing these kinds of programs like on the ground and how they're running is something that, you know, I don't think we always have the best sense of in a classroom setting. And so I just have a very sort of practical question, like the project that you were just referring to about the text messages and that intervention. What was the size of the team? What was the makeup of the folks that were running that? I mean, who was involved? Was there a project manager? Were there several economists working on it? Like, just give me a sense of sort of the almost like the human resources angle of a project like that.
Sure. So for that project, we had it was a fairly small team, and we were the organization where I was working at the time. We were partnering with another organization, so it was sort of researchers across two different organizations collaborating. It was largely the American Institutes for Research group that sort of led that study. But essentially yes, for projects like that, there will be someone typically who's designated as the project director. And so that person is generally responsible for sort of the day-to-day progress of the work and sort of monitoring the budget and making sure you're not sort of using all the resources too quickly, and kind of mapping out plans for sort of how much of the budget you're going to use for different components of the study, different tasks. So you might have a budget for kind of the data collection period, and then a budget for the reporting period where you're kind of writing up the study. But I think in that case, we had the project director was another colleague that I think she had a master's in public policy, and she had been doing the same type of work for many years. I mean, she was very senior. And so I led the evaluation. I was sort of tagged as like the evaluation lead. So my responsibility was to sort of design and then kind of execute the RCT. We had at least a couple sort of junior researchers that they may have had a master's degree. We may have had another person supporting the project without an advanced degree, and those individuals would help do things like, they might sort of run some code to do the random assignment process on a week-to-week basis, and they would handle maybe communicating with the state on, once we got the regular data transfer processes set up, they would be the ones to kind of do that communication, make sure that everything is running smoothly and all of that. When we essentially had all of the data to do the analysis, I largely led the analysis, but again, with support from others to sort of clean the data a little bit, to run some numbers, to do some analysis and generate some output, and then work with me to sort of iterate on that a little bit and identify, like the specific tables we might want to produce to put in the report, and things like that. We had another PhD economist that was part of the team. And again, I think at least maybe a couple other more junior folks. And I think I think that's probably about right for that sort of that kind of scale. I mean, there were also, we would have meetings with sort of the counties that were participating to kind of answer their questions, talk to them about anything upcoming, like if we were sort of expecting anything that we needed to make them aware of that was going to happen with the study, like, hey, we're getting ready to finish data collection or something like that, or hey, we're going to have the results soon. So the other different team members would sort of handle setting up those types of meetings and sort of communicating with the participating counties and that sort of thing. But yeah, I would say it was maybe like a 5-person team, I think, maybe numbers wise. And people sort of in that environment, people also, each one of us that were on the team have, at any given time, we would have kind of several projects that are in our kind of portfolio of work of things that we're working on at any given time. So, the other team members that were working on that project, I mean, they had other projects they were working on as well. And so the text messaging study wouldn't necessarily occupy, their entire day for the whole week or anything like that. But I don't know if that's helpful.
No, absolutely. I think that gives me and the audience like a much more concrete sense of kind of what the day-to-day of some of this looks like. And so I appreciate those details a lot.
Sure.
To change gears just a little bit, I mean, I think that most of the folks that are in attendance here are, master's students at Johns Hopkins University. There may be some other folks as well, but many of them are in the process of doing a career change or doing a sector switch or something along those lines. So I wonder, especially given the context of what you just described in terms of the duties and responsibilities of members of a team doing this kind of work, what are some areas that you would really emphasize in terms of ways they could get prepared for, sort of entry level, junior level work in a team like that? What do you think they should be sort of trying to hone, particularly at this sort of formative stage of their education and their career?
Yeah, so I think someone finishing this program and sort of joining a place that does work like that type of kind of applied, kind of policy focused work. I mean, I think that there are a handful of things that would be really beneficial to kind of set you up for getting off to a good start and sort of potentially, setting you up to be successful in kind of a career path doing that type of work. I mean, I think one is, again, that sort of attention to detail. And something that comes to mind especially is it sounds like your program is kind of focused on data and data analysis and that sort of thing, and being able to kind of support or execute and kind of support different types of rigorous data focused analyses. I think one thing that is helpful is to again think carefully about kind of when you're cleaning data or you're sort of preparing to use data, understanding how to make sense of some data that you've received and how to identify potential problems. So a lot of the work that I've done has involved getting kind of administrative data from state or federal or local agencies. And a lot of times the data that you receive, it's from a system that was not designed it didn't have kind of supporting research as kind of the top priority when that system was designed. So sometimes the data that can come in sort of odd formats, or there can be duplicates for some reason that you don't necessarily understand right away, or the data can have values that are very odd and look kind of unusual, and they may mean something, but sometimes it takes some investigation to kind of work out what exactly the data are that you have in hand and the proper way to kind of interpret and use them. And so I think having that in mind, if you were sort of joining a place and maybe you were asked to kind of take on a role on a project where you're going to be responsible for, receiving data and kind of preparing it for analysis and maybe kind of doing some analysis, being very careful about, not assuming too much about the data without kind of verifying its contents, because I think that can lead to kind of, obviously can lead to some serious problems. Like if you don't recognize early on that, this variable that you want to use, a certain value has a meaning that like you had no idea of, and then later you come to find that out when you're sort of writing the report, it can cause, clearly if it affects kind of your findings or the results of your analysis, that's something you really don't want to find out kind of at the end of the day there. So I think, yeah, just being careful and organized and trying to think through those data issues, I think that's something that would be really helpful. I mean, I also think, I believe it maybe came up earlier, just having good communication skills and being able, I mentioned about trying to communicate the results from maybe a sophisticated type of analysis that you've done. It's really important to be able to communicate effectively with others, so that it's clear to them sort of what you've done or what you intend to do or what you found when you went to clean the data, like what the problem is and why it's a problem. And so being able to communicate those things very clearly is really going to be helpful. It'd be important. So I would I would try to think about ways that you can make sure that you're comfortable doing that as well.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah, and I always appreciate when I have a talk like this, and without any pre-planning, then my guest says the same thing that I tell my students in every introductory data analysis class, where I say, look, if you don't literally look at the spreadsheets, just like see if there's anything obviously wrong with the data, like run a frequency and a unique values for every single column of your data, and just see if there's something weird in there, because that can throw things off tremendously. So thank you for our uncoordinated backup of my advice. Thank you very much for that.
That's all right.
Interesting question from the chat. I mean, this is something that we've contended with a bit in our own program. I mean, when I was in graduate school, I started about 10 years ago, you a bit before that, Scott. Like, we didn't have any AI tools, right? This was not a conversation. It wasn't part of our training. So we're all kind of learning as we go. So I'm wondering, like, have you seen any ways that sort of these new artificial intelligence tools are changing evaluation science, or have you engaged in any of that on your own? Or you just have any speculations that you'd like to share with us about what the future of that might hold?
Sure. Yeah, no, this is obviously a hot topic for everybody, is sort of AI and how it might impact the work that you either do now or sort of plan to do or want to do, right? And so, I mean, I have a few thoughts I could share. I mean, I certainly am not going to be able to sort of answer anything definitively about AI or its use or sort of the future of AI or anything like that as it applies to evaluation work. But I mean, one thing I can say is, I mean, I do know that, I mean, organizations that do applied research evaluation work kind of focused on policy, or public programs. I mean, I think almost all of those organizations are certainly working on thinking about how they can use AI to kind of improve the work they do or to do it more efficiently or more effectively. I would say, I think they're trying to be very intentional about the use of AI and really trying to understand kind of what some of its potential benefits can be in that setting, as well as what some of the risks are, and some of the things some of the downsides. I don't think there's any organization that feels like they have settled those types of questions, at this point. I think everybody is still sort of trying to navigate this environment. I mean, one example that comes to mind for me, that's sort of related to AI, it's not necessarily AI, but it's kind of similar, is I did some work where we needed to sort of extract some information from hundreds of like grant applications. And the idea was, is there a way that we can do this? Not really AI, but like using sort of natural language processing. And the idea was, listen, if we can sort of write a program that will go and kind of pull out all the information we need, clearly we're saving a lot of labor hours that we might have like a junior person or a series of junior staff go and sort of do that process kind of manually, right? Like extracting information or somehow using like a qualitative analysis tool to like code the information somehow or whatever. And that one of the questions that came up in that process and trying to think about how that might work is like, well, how well do we trust whatever might come out of that, that program that we write? Like, are we willing to kind of take that output and consider it the truth? Or do we need humans to then go back and sort of take the output and compare it to the original grant applications and kind of confirm that, like, yes, this program did pull out the right information? And so then you start to wonder, though, well, if we're going to have humans go back and double check all of this anyway, how much time are we going to really be able to save? So, I think that was sort of that wasn't an example directly related to AI, but I think the sort of problem and the approach is similar, where people might think of ways to try to use AI to summarize information or to kind of analyze some data. But I think there's going to be a question of like how well you trust whether the output from the AI is credible, or whether you need to actually go back and then attempt to sort of confirm the results. I mean, I think I will say, for me personally, I'm sort of at the beginning of my journey with using AI. I've kind of dabbled in it here and there. I haven't really made any concerted attempt to kind of really dive in and use AI a lot in my work. But I mean, I think it is the kind of thing, I don't think there's, I think it would be counterproductive to intentionally avoid using AI. Like, I think it's the kind of thing where it's clear that organizations think there's going to be some value and that they're going to be able to use AI to kind of improve the way they do their work. And so if you are unfamiliar with AI or how it works or how to use it, I think that's going to be a real disadvantage. I think even aside from doing the sort of policy focused work I've been talking about, I mean, I've been dabbling in using AI in my current role. So in a class that I'm teaching, I need to kind of write assignments where I need to have like a table of data or something like that that students are going to use to kind of do some exercises. And it's been easy to ask an AI to give me a table, and I sort of specify this is the information I want in the table, and it, processes for a few seconds and then tells me here's the table. And that saves me a lot of time from having to sort of prepare something like that on my own. So I think it would be in your best interest. And again, this is just me personally, but in my view, I feel like it would be in your best interest to look for opportunities to become familiar with some of the sort of AI tools that are out there, and to think about how you might use them, and also some of the limitations that you feel like they might have.
Yeah, that aligns very well with many of my own thoughts. And I would just add that I think that, one of the most exciting things I think actually about AI and large language models is their ability to extract information from, all kinds of documents and sort of summarize it and compress it for you. So it used to be a huge pain if every data analyst hates PDF files, traditionally speaking, right? Oh my God, if I have data in a PDF, it's almost useless to me. But the data extraction of large language models is really exceptional, and even things like forms and things like that. So I think that might be an area where there's a lot of growth going forward, is just the ability to do to automate qualitative data coding at a mass scale could be very exciting for lots of different evaluation contexts. But
Sure.
I think Chris had a question, and then I think we're getting close to the end of our time. So if there are any other questions in the chat, if any attendees want to ask anything, this is the time. But I'll go ahead and transfer over to Chris.
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of piggybacking off of the discussion about AI, although don't feel like you gotta like answer this question in terms of AI, but sort of as an educator, talking to an educator, and you're often working with undergraduates, I'm often working with graduate students. What sort of like advice do you give to students at all different sorts of levels in terms of, if lifelong learning is going to be a thing, just like we can't possibly tell what the future is going to look like, how do you make the most of your time when you're still in school? In order to kind of prepare yourself for what the world might look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's kind of a tough one. I mean, I think and again, I'm sort of also still near the beginning of my journey in terms of how what I feel like is the best guidance for students about sort of using AI or sort of avoiding AI in certain settings and that sort of thing. So for a class that I teach right now, I've told students they have to do some homework assignments that involve kind of using Microsoft Excel, and I've told them, I'm okay with you using a generative AI, but I would prefer I'm okay with it in the sense that you're going to get the most out of this, and you're going to learn if you attempt this on your own first. Like you go through the struggle of trying to do the assignment and do the problem, because that's how you learn. And then if after you've done that, you want to kind of use AI to see if a generative AI would sort of have given you the same kind of results or the same answer as what you prepared, I'm okay with you kind of doing that and kind of checking your work that way. I mean, I think that AI does have a lot of promise to kind of to for people to be able to do things that in the past have maybe been tedious, and to be able to do them much more efficiently and faster and kind of more easily. But at the same time, I think in terms of your kind of education at the undergraduate level or the graduate level, right? The goal of seeking out education is to kind of learn these things and kind of learn how to think critically, and to learn skills for yourself. And so too heavy a reliance on AI, I feel like, is you're sort of robbing yourself of developing those critical thinking skills and those other skills that the educational experience is designed to give you. So I think there's, like I said, I think there's no point in completely avoiding AI because you maybe don't like it or you disagree with it philosophically, and I'm sympathetic to all of those arguments. But I don't think, as you said, like, it's better to sort of have a growth mindset and look at it as maybe an opportunity that you can use to kind of maybe learn new skills that do use AI in ways that complement sort of the educational process rather than sort of substitute for it.
I agree. I agree completely. So a great thought to sort of close our conversation with. Well, thank you very much, Scott, for your time. If anyone else has any questions that they can think of after this talk, if they want to shoot me an email, I can forward them to Scott and connect you as makes sense. So feel free to. I'll just go ahead and put my my email address in the chat here, so everyone has access to that. Yeah, but if there are any follow-ups after the talk that come to mind, feel free to shoot me a message. Other than that, I appreciate Scott's time today. Thank you, Chris, for joining us as well. And I wish everyone else a great rest of your day. So thank you for coming to this edition of Data Dimensions.